My name is Ren Whitmore. I was 18 years old the winter my mother chose a man over her own children. My brother Silas was 16. We had $87 between us, and we bought a stone mansion that no living soul in 3 counties would set foot inside. 11 cars in the yard, 2 airplanes in the trees, a trapdoor in the floor of the east bedroom that had not been lifted in 34 years. I want to tell you what we found down those 8 uneven steps. I want to tell you about the woman who painted in the dark for 17 years and never showed her work to a living soul. I want to tell you about the pilot who built her that house and then vanished to keep her safe. And I want to tell you how 2 frozen kids from a nothing town in Kentucky became the answer to a promise a dying man made in California in 1989. But first, sit down. Pour yourself a cup of coffee or tea, whatever warms your hands, because this story is going to take some time. The snow started falling in Millbrook Springs on the first Thursday of December. I remember because I was standing at the sink in our mother's kitchen washing 3 coffee cups, and I looked up through the window over the faucet and I saw the first flakes coming down. Small at first, then bigger. The kind of snow that means business. Millbrook Springs, Kentucky. Population 2,000 and change. 3 hours south of Louisville by the state road. A diner on Main Street called Dots. A feed store with a bell over the door. A Methodist church with a white steeple that leaned about 2 degrees to the west. And a Piggly Wiggly grocery on the edge of town where I worked bagging groceries 3 evenings a week for $6 an hour. My mother's name was Marlene Whitmore. She had married Derek Halloran 5 years before when I was 13, and Silas was 11, and Derek had come into our lives the way a stray dog comes into a yard. Quiet, watching, never quite trusted. He worked as an electrician for the county school district. He drove a red Ford F-150 with a bumper sticker that said, "If you can read this, you're too close." He never hit us. He never raised his voice. He just did not see us. I was the chair he walked around to get to the television. Silas was the noise he asked to stop making. For 5 years, that was the whole arrangement. And I made myself smaller and smaller and smaller. Until one Thursday night in early December, with the first snow of the season coming down outside my bedroom window, I heard him through the wall. His voice was low, careful, but I heard him. "It's them or me, Marlene." I was lying on my bed with my headphones off because I like to fall asleep listening to the wind. And when I heard those 4 words, my whole body went very still, the way a rabbit goes still when a shadow passes over the grass. My mother did not answer right away. A song played on the kitchen radio. Loretta Lynn, if I remember right. I lay in the dark and I counted the seconds. I counted to 40. I counted to 60. I counted until the song ended and another one started. Then she said 2 words. All right. That was it. That was the whole sentence. That was the whole decision. 2 words from the woman who had painted my bedroom door yellow when I was 6. 2 words from the woman who had packed little notes in my lunchbox in the 2nd grade that said, "I love you, Rennie, have a good day." 2 words, and my whole life was different. The next morning, she called me and Silas into the living room. She was sitting on the edge of the couch with both hands folded in her lap, like she was waiting to be called back at the dentist. She was looking out the window at the snow. She did not look at us. She said we were old enough now. She said the situation in the house had become unworkable. She said she would help us where she could, but we needed to find our own place. She said all of this the way you read the back of a cereal box. She did not cry. She did not hug us. She did not use our names. Silas stood in the doorway with his hands shoved in the pockets of his flannel. He was 16 years old. He was 6'2", already taller than Derek, and he had my grandfather's hands, long and quick. Silas could take apart a lawnmower engine and put it back together before dinner. He had been fixing things around that house for as long as I could remember. He did not say a word. I watched his jaw work. I watched him breathe in and out through his nose. I watched him make a choice not to speak, because whatever he had to say would not have made any difference to the woman on the couch. She told us we had 7 days. Now, I want you to do something for me. If you have ever stood in a room with your own mother and felt her decide you were the problem, if you have ever waited for her to look up from her lap and take it back, and she did not leave me a red heart in the comments right now. Just a red heart. So I know you are with me. So I know you understand what that morning felt like. Because I need you with me for what comes next. I need to tell you something about myself. I am a person who cannot throw anything away. Not a movie ticket from when I was 12, not a receipt from the last grocery run I ever took with my grandmother, not the dried brown leaf I picked up on the first day of high school because the morning had felt important, not the strand of fur from the collar of my dog Buster who died 4 years ago in the back of my mother's station wagon on the way to the vet. I kept it all. In tins, in drawers, in old shoeboxes lined up under my bed, 3 deep. My mother called it junk. I called it memory. And in the 7 days between her saying 7 days and the seventh day, I had to decide what kind of person I was going to be. Was I the kind who could let go, or was I the kind who carried everything? I packed 4 suitcases, a green hardshell with one wheel missing, a red duffel from a high school field trip I never went on, a plastic milk crate from the Piggly Wiggly, and my grandmother's old leather train case, the one with her initials EP stamped in faded gold on the brass clasp. I packed it all. Every receipt, every leaf, every ticket stub. Because if I left it behind, my mother would throw it out. And if my mother threw it out, then none of it had ever mattered. And if none of it had ever mattered, then maybe I had never mattered either. Silas packed one thing, a wooden toolbox my grandfather had built with his own hands in 1962. It weighed almost 50 pounds. It smelled like sawdust and machine oil and something older than either of us. On the third night of packing around 2 in the morning, I opened the tin box on the top shelf of my closet, my grandmother's tin. I had not opened it in 8 years, because opening it meant smelling her perfume, and smelling her perfume meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling. And at 10 years old, I had decided I could not afford to feel. I opened it. Inside were pearl earrings, a church bulletin from Easter Sunday, 1998, a pressed violet, and folded twice very small, tucked underneath everything else, a piece of yellow stationery in her handwriting. My dear ones, there are houses in this world that are waiting for children who don't have any. Keep your eyes open. The world is bigger than this kitchen. All my love always. Grandma. I sat on my bedroom floor in the dark and held that piece of paper in my hand for a long time. My grandmother's name was Eleanor Peterson. She had died when I was 10. She was the softest thing that ever came into my life, and when she went, she took the softness with her. I had no idea what she meant by that note. I had no idea why she had written it, or when, or what she wanted me to do with it. But I folded it back into the tin, and I packed the tin with everything else. And that is when Silas came into my room. He shut the door behind him. He sat down on the edge of my bed. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. He said, "Ren, I have to tell you something." I said, "All right." He said, "I found something 6 months ago in the basement in an old box behind the water heater." He reached into his flannel and pulled out a leather notebook. It was small. It was very old. The corners were rounded from being handled by hands that were now dust. He said it was Grandma's. He opened it and turned to a page near the back. He handed it to me. The handwriting was hers. I would have known it anywhere. She wrote about a summer she had spent when she was 20 years old. A summer she had spent driving out every Saturday to a stone house in the country, a house at the end of a dirt road past the last working farm 22 miles from Louisville, a house where a woman lived alone and painted pictures nobody ever saw. She wrote that the woman had been her teacher, that the woman had believed in her, that the woman had told her one afternoon that art was the only way a lonely person could speak to the future. She wrote that she had promised to come back one day. She wrote that she never did. I looked up at Silas. He said, "I didn't tell you because I didn't understand it, but I think Grandma was trying to tell us something. I think she left us that note on purpose." I said, "Silas, where is that house?" He said, "I don't know. She never wrote the address, but she wrote the county." He looked me in the eye. He said, "Ren, it's here. It's in this county, 22 miles out." On the 7th night, I stood in the front doorway of the only house I had ever lived in. 4 suitcases, a toolbox, my grandmother's coat, which still smelled faintly of her lavender soap even after all this time. Silas beside me in the flannel he had worn every winter since 8th grade. My mother was in the kitchen. I could hear the television, a Folgers commercial, the one with the soldier coming home for Christmas. We stood at the door. I held the brass knob in my right hand. I waited. I waited for her to come out of the kitchen. I waited for her to say our names. I waited for any sign at all that what we were doing could be undone. Nothing came. Just the soldier and the Folgers and the smell of coffee that was going to stay in those walls long after we were gone. I closed the door behind us. Snow worked its way down into the back of my collar before I had taken 3 steps. 6 blocks to the bus stop. A metal bench under a flickering streetlight. Silas and I sat there with our things between our knees, and we watched the buses come and the buses go and the people get on and the people get off, and we did not move. Around midnight, I called the only person I could think of. Her name was Wendy Bennett, 22 years old. She worked the register at the Piggly Wiggly on the shift after mine. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above the laundromat with 2 cats and a parakeet that could say her name. Everybody in Millbrook Springs called her Wendell because when she was 6 years old, she had insisted on being called Wendell like the little boy in Peter Pan, and it stuck. She picked up on the 5th ring. Ren, it's after midnight. My mom kicked us out, me and Silas. There was a pause. She said, "How far are you from the laundromat?" I said 6 blocks. She said, "Come." We dragged our things through the snow. She met us at the side door in flannel pajamas with a knit cap pulled down over her ears. She made us tea we did not drink. She gave us blankets that smelled like cats. She let us sleep on her floor for 3 nights. On the 3rd day, on my lunch break at the Piggly Wiggly, I walked down to the newsstand on the corner of Main and Willow Street. Mr. Petrov ran that newsstand. He had run it for 37 years. He was 81 years old, and he had come over from a place called Lviv when he was very small, before it had even been called Ukraine, when his parents had put him on a boat with a tag pinned to his coat. He sold newspapers and magazines and Trident gum and Reader's Digest condensed books. And on the wire rack by the door, the Bluegrass Rural Register, which came out 3 times a week on real newsprint that turned your fingers black. I did not have money to spare for a newspaper. The $87 I had saved from 2 years at the Piggly Wiggly was locked in an envelope in my grandmother's tin. Money for what came next, whatever that was. In my coat pocket, I had $6.43, and it had to last me until payday. So I stood at the rack and I read for free. Mr. Petrov never said a word. He would just nod at me when I walked in and nod at me when I walked out. Once on a Tuesday, he had slid a Hershey bar across the counter and said, "Tell no one." That was the only conversation we had ever had. But on the 3rd day at Wendell's, when I walked into the newsstand and turned to the classifieds in the back of the register, I saw the ad that would change our lives. It was 3 lines. Real property for sale, rural, 22 miles from Louisville, structure extensive, needs work, price negotiable for reasonable offer, no questions about history of property answered. A phone number at the bottom. I read it 3 times. I had never in my life seen a real estate ad that said no questions about history of property answered. That is the kind of thing you put in an ad when you already know exactly what people are going to ask. I stood there at the rack and I felt something turn over in my chest. Something I had not felt since the night my mother said, "All right." It was curiosity. The way I used to feel curiosity before everything closed up. Mr. Petrov looked at me over the top of his glasses. He said, "Find something." I said, "Yes, sir." That was the whole conversation. I copied the phone number onto the back of my hand. I walked back to the Piggly Wiggly. I finished my shift. And that night, on Wendell's floor, with both cats curled up on my chest, I typed the address into the search bar on my phone. The address did not come up on Google Maps. It did not come up on Zillow. It did not come up on any real estate site at all. It came up twice, both times in a private Facebook group called Old Millbrook Springs Folks Remember. Both posts were old, from 2014, from 2017. The comments were what got me. One person wrote that her grandfather had said no one could stay there more than a week. Another wrote that the place had been cursed since 1968 and everybody knew it. Someone said an entire family had disappeared inside. Someone else said the county was going to condemn the property soon and burn it down. A woman with a profile picture of a Persian cat had written in all capital letters, "Do not buy that property. Do not." And then there was a comment from a user named Margaret Callahan. Her profile picture was of an older woman standing in front of a sunflower the size of her own face. Her comment said, "My older brother worked there as a carpenter in 1953. He did not talk about it after, but he told my mother once late in his life that there was something under the floor." I stared at that comment. I went to take a screenshot. And in the 2 seconds between when I opened the screenshot function and when I pressed the button, the comment was gone. Deleted. Margaret Callahan had taken it down. Silas was lying on the couch. He sat up. He said, "What?" I said, "Look at this thread. Look at the top comment." He looked. He said, there is no top comment. I said, there was one 2 seconds ago, a woman named Margaret Callahan. She said there was something under the floor, and there was another one further down about a Peterson girl in 1968. That one is gone too. Silas went very still. He said, Peterson. Grandma's name. I said, yes. Silas grabbed my phone. He scrolled up and down through the thread. He refreshed it. Nothing. But he had been faster than I had. He pulled his own phone out of his pocket. He had taken a screenshot 10 seconds after the page had loaded. The comment was there. Peterson girl. Summer of 1968. She used to come out to that house every Saturday to learn to paint. Silas looked up at me. He said, Ren. Grandma was there. I did not sleep that night. I lay on Wendell's floor in the dark with both cats on my chest, and I thought about a note that said the world was bigger than this kitchen. And I thought about a summer in 1968 when my grandmother had been 20 years old and had driven out to a house at the end of a dirt road to learn to paint from a woman who never showed her work. I thought about my mother in a kitchen 6 blocks away with the television on. I thought about the way silence can inherit itself down through the generations of a family. Grandmother to daughter. All of us quieted for different reasons. All of us convinced the quiet was our own idea. And somewhere in the dark, I felt something old and stubborn turn over inside me and decide not to die. I called the number at 7:30 the next morning. It rang for a long time. I almost hung up. When someone finally picked up the voice on the other end was a man's. Old. Tired. The kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. Hello. I am calling about the property. A long silence. I could hear him breathing. He said, did you read the part of the ad that said we don't answer questions about history? I did, he said, and I said, and I am not calling about the history. I am calling because my brother and I need a place to live. We have everything we saved from 2 years of working. That is all we have in the world. Another silence, longer this time. He said, how much do you have? I said, $87. He said, you said your brother. Yes, sir. My brother is 16. I am 18. Another silence. So long I thought he might have hung up. Then he said, are you coming to see it before you decide? I said yes. He said, meet me at the gate tomorrow. 10 in the morning. If you still want it after you see it, the place is yours for what you have. He hung up before I could ask his name. I want you to stop with me for a moment. Picture that morning. 2 kids on a Greyhound bus at 6:45 in the morning riding 48 minutes to Louisville. Transferring to a rural connector that ran twice a day out toward the horse country. Getting off at a junction called Bramble Hollow that didn't even have a real stop, just a metal sign and a bench with one leg missing. From there, 1 mile down a county road with no shoulder. Then a 1/4 mile down a dirt road the county had not plowed and probably had not graded in 2 seasons. Snow up to our knees in places. Take a breath. Refill your cup if you need to. Because everything you are about to hear from this point on, the 11 cars, the 2 airplanes, the trapdoor in the floor, the woman who painted in secret for 17 years, all of it is on the other side of that walk. And I want you with me when we come around the bend and see the gate for the first time. Are you ready? Then here we go. We came around a bend in the dirt road. The trees opened up. And there it was. A wrought iron gate. The cast iron kind they don't make anymore. 8 feet tall. Vines grown through the bars like the gate had decided to become part of the woods. Behind the gate, a long curving drive disappearing under fresh snow. And at the end of the drive, rising up out of the white like it had been there for 1,000 years, and not one day less the house. Gray fieldstone. 2 stories. Arched windows on the 2nd floor with an elegance no modern house I had ever seen had even tried for. A front porch collapsed on one end. 3 holes in the roof I could see from the road. But the bones of that house were not ruined. The bones were standing. I stood at the gate for a full minute before I could move. Silas said, Ren. I said, I see them. He was not looking at the house, he was looking at the yard. In the photo online, they had been blurry shapes. In person, they were a graveyard, 11 of them, scattered across the property at angles that suggested they had been parked over many years and never moved again. Closest to the gate, a Ford from the 40s. So rusted, I could not have told you the model. Behind it, a Chevy Bel Air from the 50s with the roof caved in, a delivery truck whose cab had been colonized by a juniper bush that was now 4 feet tall, A European sports car low slung, the kind I had only ever seen in old movies, sitting on 4 piles of dirt where the tires used to be. And 3 more vehicles I could not even identify because the rust and the moss had erased every distinguishing feature. Silas walked slowly along the fence line. He stopped in front of a Studebaker with the hood propped open like somebody had been halfway through a repair that never finished. He said, "Ren, these are worth something. Not the way they are now. But if somebody knew what they were doing," he did not finish the sentence. Then he looked past the cars toward the back of the property, and he went very still. He said, "Ren." I looked. 2 airplanes, maybe 200 yards from the house, half hidden by pines. In the Facebook photo, they had been 2 dark silhouettes against the tree line. In person, they were enormous. The closer one was a twin-engine bird, olive green paint peeling down to bare aluminum. A faded white star on the tail under all the moss. The propellers bent sideways like the plane had skidded to a stop in soft mud 40 years ago and never been moved again. The other was smaller, civilian. The wheels of its landing gear sunk to the hubs. How does a person land an airplane that size on private land without anybody noticing? How does a person leave it there for decades? I stood between the cars and the planes and the mansion, and I felt the world get very quiet. I felt the back of my neck prickle. I felt like I was being watched. But there was no one there. Just me and Silas and the snow and a property that the entire town had decided not to look at for 34 years. He came down the road on foot about 10 minutes after we got there. Tall, stooped, maybe 76 years old. White hair under a wool cap. A dark coat that had clearly been expensive 40 years ago and had been worn ever since. He carried a ring of keys on a leather strap so old the leather had cracked through. He looked at me. He looked at Silas. He said, "You're the ones who called." I said, "Yes, sir. I'm Ren Whitmore. This is my brother Silas." He did not tell us his name, not at the gate. He just nodded. "Ashford," he said finally, as if the word had been pulled out of him. "Ellsworth Ashford." He unlocked the gate. The hinges screamed. He pushed it open just wide enough for the 3 of us to slip through. We walked up the drive together without speaking. I kept stealing looks at him. His face had the kind of stillness you only see on men who have spent a lot of years not talking. He led us up the steps to the front door. There was no door. There was a doorway, and what used to be a door lying on the porch floor under a film of snow. We went inside. I want you to picture this with me. A grand entrance hall, 20 feet tall. A staircase rising up the right wall to a landing that had collapsed at one corner. The floor was hardwood, wide planks, black with age and water and 100 winters with nothing keeping the weather out. The smell hit me like a wall. Mold, rotten wood, wet earth, and something underneath all of that I could not name. Mr. Ashford showed us the rooms. He did not talk. A parlor with a fireplace the size of a doorway. A dining room with built-in glass cabinets along one wall. A library with empty shelves of black walnut that ran floor to ceiling. A kitchen with a wood-burning stove still standing in the middle of the floor, and on top of it a cast-iron pot with the lid still on. I stared at that pot. Somebody had walked out of the kitchen for a minute decades ago and never walked back. We went up the stairs. They groaned, but they held. 3 bedrooms on the second floor. The master bedroom had a hole in the ceiling the size of a kitchen table. The whole time Mr. Ashford walked behind us, not in front, as if he did not want to be the one to lead us into anything. As if he wanted us to choose room by room whether we were really doing this. We went back downstairs. We stood in the middle of the front parlor. The sun came through the broken windows in long bars that hit the dust in the air and turned it gold. I looked at Silas. He gave me one small nod. I looked at Mr. Ashford. I said, "We want it." He did not react the way I thought he would. He did not try to talk us out of it. He did not ask if we were sure. He did not ask our age. He just looked at me for a long moment with those still gray eyes. And what I saw in them I did not understand. Until much later. It was not surprise. It was not doubt. It was relief. The relief of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had just felt the weight begin to lift. He opened a leather folio from under his coat. He pulled out a deed and a transfer document and a yellow legal pad. He sat down on a stone step inside what used to be the parlor and began filling in numbers in pencil. He said, "You said you had $87. I said yes. He did not even pause writing. He said, "Then that's the price." He had us sign in 3 places. He countersigned. He told us his closing attorney would file the deed at the county clerk's office on Monday. He said the property would legally be in our names by end of business. I asked him if we could move in that day. He said yes. He handed me the ring of keys. And then he did something I did not expect. He walked to the gate, stopped halfway, turned, and looked back. Not at us. Past us. At the 2 airplanes at the back of the property. He stood there for so long I thought he was praying. When he finally turned to face us, his hands were trembling. Both hands. The key ring was already ours, but he was still holding his hand out as if he had something else to give. He said, "Miss Whitmore, if you find anything in that house, anything at all, do me one favor." I said, "What favor?" He said, "Do not burn it. No matter what you find, no matter what you read, do not burn any of it." His voice did not shake, but his hands did. I did not know what to say, so I just nodded. He nodded back. He turned, and he walked down the dirt road in the falling snow until he was a speck, and then he was gone. Silas and I stood at the gate of the property we had just bought for $87. I had 4 suitcases full of receipts and ticket stubs. Silas had a 50-pound toolbox. We had a granola bar in my coat pocket, and absolutely no idea what the old man had just told us not to burn. Now, before I take you inside for good, I want you to do something for me. Rest your eyes a minute, pour yourself another cup. And when you come back, tell me in the comments, because I really want to know, do you believe in fate? Or do you think it is all just accident? 2 kids at a bus stop, a grandmother's note in a tin, a comment deleted at exactly the wrong moment. Was it luck? Was it something else? What do you think? I'll wait for you. Because what comes next is the part of the story I have never told anybody. The first 2 weeks were the hardest 2 weeks I had ever lived through. There was no electricity. There was no plumbing. The well outside was frozen 6 feet deep. The wood-burning stove in the kitchen still worked technically if you knew how to start a fire in a 140-year-old cast-iron monster and did not mind clouds of black soot blowing back at you every time the wind shifted. Silas knew. He had my grandfather's toolbox. He had my grandfather's hands. Within one afternoon, he had that stove throwing heat like a forge. Within 2 days, he had it dialed to a slow, even burn that would go all night on 3 good logs. I want you to understand what my brother did in those first 2 weeks, because I have not said it out loud very often. Silas was 16 years old. He was still supposed to be a junior in high school, and he took that stone mansion in his 2 hands and made it livable 1 room at a time. He patched the worst hole in the parlor roof with a sheet of plywood he found in the barn out back. He rigged a rain barrel to catch runoff. He built a smaller fire in the fireplace for warmth so we did not have to sleep in the kitchen. He set traps for the raccoons that had been coming in through the pantry. And every night, when he was too tired to keep his eyes open, he sat with me by the lantern and asked me what I wanted to eat the next day. As if we had choices. As if I were still his big sister and he were still my little brother and this were still normal. I would have died that first winter without him. On the 4th night, the snow came hard. I could hear it before I could see it. The wind picked up around 8 in the evening. By 10, it was a howl. By midnight, it was a long, unbroken roar coming down through the holes in the roof and across the broken windows and through every crack in every wall. A piece of the kitchen ceiling came down. Then a piece of the upstairs hall. Then water. Cold water. Pouring through 3 different places in the parlor where we had been sleeping. Silas and I dragged our mattresses into the back pantry off the kitchen. It was no bigger than a closet. It had 1 small window high in the wall. We wedged ourselves in there with the cats Wendell had made us take one of her cats when we left a black and white one named Beatrice, and we sat with our backs against the pantry door and listened to the house come apart around us. I started crying. Not the way you cry when you were a kid. Not the way you cry when something specific has happened and you can point to it and say, this is why. I cried the way you cry when there is nobody left to call. I cried because Wendell was not going to answer her phone at 1 in the morning. I cried because Mr. Petrov was 81 years old and asleep behind his newsstand. I cried because my mother had a television on in a kitchen and she did not for 1 second hear me. Silas put his arm around my shoulders. He said, Ren, he said, we are going to be okay. He said, I promise. He was 16 years old, and he said it like a man who had already decided what he was going to spend his life doing. The storm passed by morning. We were alive. The house was still standing. And on the fifth day, Silas found the trapdoor. He had been checking floors for 2 days, testing them with his heel mapping which rooms we could actually move into and which ones would drop us straight into the cellar. The east bedroom floor was solid, mostly. But there was one spot 3 steps in from the door where the boards felt different. Not soft, not rotten, different. The way they moved was strange, like they were hinged. He knelt down. He brushed away the dust and the dead leaves that had blown in through a broken window over the years. And he felt with his fingertips along the edges of the boards. There was a seam, a clean square seam, about 3 feet by 3 feet cut into the floor, and at the center of the seam, almost invisible under 34 years of grime, an iron ring, a handle. He looked up at me from the floor. I sat down on my heels beside him. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I thought about Mr. Ashford's hand shaking at the gate. I thought about Margaret Callahan's comment vanishing in 2 seconds. I thought about a brother who had worked there as a carpenter in 1953 and never spoke of it again, and once late in his life told his mother there was something under the floor. Silas said, "Should we?" I said yes. He wrapped his fingers around the iron ring. He took a long breath. He pulled. The trapdoor lifted with a dry sigh, like something exhaling for the first time in decades. Dust rose. I waited for the dust to settle. I clicked on the flashlight on my phone and pointed it down through the open hatch. A wooden staircase descended into the dark. I counted the steps from the top. 8. 8 steps down. But the steps were not the same height. Each one was a little different. As if whoever had built them had wanted you to slow down. As if going down these stairs was meant to be a deliberate act. Not something you could do in a hurry. Silas went first, because that is who my brother is. I followed. When the sole of my boot touched packed earth at the bottom of those stairs, I raised the light. What I saw on the walls of the room around me stopped my breath in my throat. Stone walls, floor to ceiling. The same gray fieldstone as the outside of the house, cut and fitted by somebody who knew exactly what he was doing. A wooden ceiling about 8 feet above me made of dark planks laid tight as a ship's deck. And on those stone walls from the dirt floor up to the height my arms could reach paintings. Not scribbles, not decorations. Paintings. Big ones. Some of them 6 feet tall. I stood at the bottom of the 8 steps with my phone flashlight in my hand, and I turned in a slow circle. And what I saw was the closest thing to a miracle that had ever happened to me. Human figures with faces so alive, I felt like I had walked into a room full of people and interrupted a conversation. Landscapes with depth that should not have been possible in oil paint. A woman at a window, a child running with a kite, 2 airplanes in formation against a yellow sky, an empty kitchen with a cast iron pot on the stove. I knew that kitchen. I knew that pot. It was the kitchen upstairs from this house, painted from memory or from love, by somebody who had stood at that stove and looked at that pot and thought, this is something I want to keep. Silas walked slowly, the flashlight beam dragging across the stones. Some paintings were framed, hung in careful straight lines, the way you hang things when you have all the time in the world and nobody to hurry you. Some were unframed, leaning in stacks of 3 and 4 against the walls, wrapped in linen that had yellowed from white to the color of old paper. And on the far wall, along the entire length of the room, a wooden shelving unit, floor to ceiling, with leather tubes laid in it sideways, dozens of them, the way wine bottles get laid in a cellar, scrolled canvases, stored carefully by somebody who knew. In the center of the room, under the wooden ceiling, a long workbench, heavy dark oak, stained in every color of paint anyone had ever ground or mixed or spilled, brushes in glass jars, the bristles stiff as wire, tubes of paint cracked and dry, pallets hanging on wall hooks like medals, and on one corner of the workbench, stacked neat, a pile of leather-bound notebooks. I counted them with my eyes. 12, maybe more. Underneath the notebooks, a packet of letters tied with twine. The envelopes faded to the color of wheat. I sat down on the dirt floor in the middle of it all. I set the flashlight on the floor beside me with the beam pointed up at the ceiling so the whole room glowed. And I wept. Not the way I had cried in the pantry during the storm. That had been the sound of being alone. This was different. This was the sound of finding something I had never been told existed. Silas sat down on the dirt floor beside me. He did not say anything. He just sat with his shoulder against mine, and I felt him understanding too. Because Silas was like me. He was the kind of person who kept things. Whoever had made this room had done it for the same reason my brother saved every screw from every appliance he had ever taken apart, because throwing a thing away was the same as saying it never mattered. Silas held my hand as we climbed back up those 8 steps. Neither of us said a word. We closed the trapdoor behind us. We sat at the kitchen workbench for a long time before either of us moved. I took one notebook up with me that afternoon. Just one. The smallest one. From the bottom of the stack, with cracked leather and a brass clasp turning green with age, I sat down at the kitchen workbench, which Silas had propped up on bricks because 2 of its legs were broken, and I opened the notebook to the first page. The handwriting was small, slanted right, disciplined. The kind of penmanship that belongs to a person who has been writing for so long in so many languages that letters have become second nature. In the top right corner of the first page, in the same small slanted hand, 2 lines. Adeline Moretti, April 12th, 1948. I read the name 3 times. I had never heard it in my life. Now let me stop with you again for a moment, because I know that some of you have felt what I felt sitting at that workbench. Some of you have opened a box in an attic, or a drawer in a mother's kitchen after the funeral, or a letter from someone you had almost forgotten. And you have found a life in there, a whole life, waiting for you to notice it. If you have ever had that feeling, that quiet moment when a stranger from another time becomes suddenly terribly real to you, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear. Because that is what happened to me the first time I read Adeline Moretti's name. She became real to me before I ever knew what she looked like. And she stayed real to me every single day after. Now, let me tell you who she was. I read every notebook in that pile over the next 4 weeks. I went down those 8 steps every morning after I built up the stove. I came back up every evening when the light got too thin to read by. Adeline Moretti was born in Louisville, Kentucky on October 9th, 1912. Her parents had come over from the hills outside Florence in 1908. Her father was a stonemason. He laid the foundations of half the buildings on Bardstown Road and never put his name on a single one. Her mother was a seamstress. She mended vestments for the Italian parish priest in exchange for fresh tomatoes from the rectory garden. They came over with nothing. They built a life with their hands, like a million other families did, like maybe your own grandparents did. Adeline was their only child, and from the time she was 6 years old, she could draw. When she was 23 in the spring of 1935, an Italian Cultural Association in New York sent her on a scholarship to Florence, 3 years to study with the masters who had been formed in the last golden age of European painting. She wrote about Florence the way you write about a first love. About the light in the courtyard of the Uffizi at 5 in the morning while the cleaners swept the marble. About the smell of turpentine in the studios. About teachers who would walk past her easel and not say anything for weeks, and then one Tuesday lay a hand on her shoulder and say a single sentence in Italian that would make her cry for 2 days. She wrote about belonging. She wrote about it like a person who had spent her whole life not having it and had crossed an ocean and found it. But the Europe of the late 1930s was not a place where a young woman could rest. In the spring of 1938, Adeline packed her things. She got on a boat in Genoa with a steamer trunk full of canvases and a small folio of letters of introduction nobody would ever read. She came home to Kentucky. She did not bring back only what she had learned. She brought back a wound, a quiet one, the kind you only see when you know what to look for. She wrote in one notebook in 1941, "There is a particular pain, the pain of having found the place where you should have been born and not being able to stay." I read that line at 2 in the morning by the light of the lantern in the kitchen of a house I had bought for $87. And I understood it, because there are 2 ways a person can be displaced. One is the way Adeline was displaced, born in the wrong country. The other is the way Silas and I were displaced, born in the right country to a mother who could not love us. The shape is the same. Adeline lived alone in Louisville for 10 years, in a small rented house on Willow Avenue. Her father died in 1947. Her mother had been gone since 1942. The small inheritance was not enough to buy land, but it was enough to keep her painting. So she kept painting. Alone, in a second-floor bedroom that got the morning light, and she did not show her work to anyone. Gallery men came to see her, she served them tea, she listened, she said no. She wrote, "Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is not exposing yourself. It is resisting the pressure to expose yourself when the exposing would mean betraying something essential. And then in the spring of 1949, she wrote one line that changed everything. A pilot landed his airplane in the field by the bend in the road today. His engine was bad. I stopped because my father taught me about engines, and I have not had the chance to use what he taught me in a very long time. His name was Jasper Whitfield, Colonel Jasper Whitfield, if you ask the men who had flown with him. He had been born in 1918 in Louisville. His family had money. His grandfather had been in the railroad business. His father ran a small shipping outfit on the Ohio River out of Cincinnati. Jasper had grown up with means. Means meant that when the country went to war in 1941, Jasper did not have to enlist. He enlisted anyway. Army Air Corps. He learned to fly transport planes, the big ones, the ones that hauled supplies across mountain ranges to bases where the men were running low on everything. He flew what they called the hump. That was the route over the Himalayas from India into China, the most dangerous supply route of the whole war. Pilots who flew the hump had a life expectancy measured in months. Jasper flew it for 22 months and came home alive. He came home different. Adeline wrote in the spring of 1950, Jasper is not a man of many words. He says what he says, and then he does not say more. But when he speaks, you find that you have leaned in to listen, and you find that what he has said is worth the leaning. I read that line and I thought of Mr. Ashford at the gate. That sentence could have been written about Mr. Ashford. Adeline had told Jasper that first afternoon that she could tell a carburetor from a piston because her father had been a mechanic before he was a stonemason. She said if he wanted a second pair of eyes, she had time. They sat on the grass by the side of the road for 2 hours. They talked about engines. They talked about Florence. They talked about the war. When the engine was fixed, Jasper shook her hand, got into his airplane, started the engine, lifted off, and he flew straight over her car as she drove home. He flew low. He waved. She wrote, I had not laughed out loud in 8 years. I put that notebook down. I had not laughed out loud in 8 years. I knew exactly how long 8 years was. 8 years was the length of time I had not opened my grandmother's tin. Let me ask you something while I catch my own breath. When was the last time you laughed out loud? Really laughed. The kind that surprises you. The kind that comes up out of your chest before you can decide whether you are going to let it. If it has been a while, that is all right. It had been 8 years for Adeline. It had been almost as long for me. Some of us go quiet for a long time before we remember what our own voices sound like. But somebody somewhere is going to make you laugh like that again. Leave me a comment. Tell me when it was for you. The last time you laughed, like Adeline laughed that afternoon on the side of the road. I want to know. Now. Back to Kentucky. While I was reading, Silas was working. He had been out at those airplanes and those cars for 2 weeks, in the cold, in gloves that had holes in the fingertips. He was not trying to fix them. Not yet. He was cataloging them. He had a spiral notebook of his own. He was writing down every make and model, every serial number, every condition note. He came in one afternoon while I was reading, and he sat down across from me at the workbench. He said, Wren. He said, the C-47. I said, the what? He said, the big airplane in the back. It's a Douglas C-47 Skytrain. It's the exact model of plane they used to fly the hump during the Second World War. This one has serial numbers from Wright Field. I looked at him. He said, Wren, whoever owned this house. He flew this plane in the war. I said his name out loud for the first time. Jasper Whitfield. Silas said, you know his name. I said, I know his name. While I read notebook after notebook, Silas kept going out to those airplanes. He would come inside frozen. He would warm his hands over the stove. He would tell me one new thing he had figured out about wiring, about paint schemes, about the way somebody had shut those planes down deliberately one final time and never come back for them. One evening, he sat down across from me and said, Wren, the other plane, the little one, it's a Beechcraft Model 18. It's a civilian bird. But somebody flew it a lot. Somebody flew it a whole lot. He looked at me. He said, I think whoever owned this house was still flying long after the war ended. I did not tell him yet what I was learning from Adeline's notebooks. I did not tell him yet about the routes Jasper Whitfield had flown after 1945 or why. I was not ready to say it out loud, because to say it out loud was to make it true. And I did not yet know if I could bear how beautiful it was going to be. Instead, I said, Silas, what are we going to do with all this? He said, with all what? I said, with everything. The cars, the airplanes, the paintings, All of it. He was quiet a long time. He said, "Ren, I have been thinking about that." He said, "I don't think we should do anything with any of it except keep it." He said, "I think somebody left all of this here on purpose, and I think we should honor that." He said it quiet, steady, like the words had been sitting in him for weeks, waiting for permission to come out. Cyrus Delaney came into our lives on a Tuesday. The second big storm of the winter had knocked out a section of the upstairs hall ceiling. I had climbed up into the attic with a tarp and a hammer and my flashlight in my mouth, and I had done my best. And my best had not been enough. Silas needed real lumber. He needed real nails. He needed advice from a person who knew what he was doing. So he took the truck we had borrowed from Wendell's uncle and he drove into town to the feed store, which in Millbrook Springs was also the hardware store. And also, if you asked the right way, the place where you found out who knew what about carpentry. He came home with an old man following him in a rust-red Ford pickup. Cyrus Delaney was 72 years old, wiry, short, blue eyes so pale they looked almost silver. He had been a carpenter all his life, and his father had been a carpenter, and his grandfather had been a carpenter. He walked up onto our porch with a thermos of coffee in one hand and a leather tool belt slung over his shoulder. And he looked at the tarp Silas had nailed over the hall ceiling, and he shook his head. He said, "Young man, young lady, you either listen to me from here on out, or you are going to die in this house of stubbornness by April." Silas said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Yes, sir." Cyrus said, "Get in the truck. We are going to the lumberyard." I want you to understand what Cyrus Delaney did for us, because I have never quite figured out how to say it right. He bought everything we needed, in his own name, on his own account. He told us to pay him back when we could. I told him we might not be able to for years. He shrugged. He said, "Honey, you have time. I have a wife and a daughter in Bowling Green and 3 grandchildren and 1 good knee. I have what I need. Pay me back when the dust settles. If it doesn't, then I helped a girl and a boy fix a roof. I will sleep fine either way." He drove out to our place every other day in that rust-red Ford. He brought tools we did not have. He brought a thermos of coffee his wife made every morning. Her name was Ruthie. She sent casseroles wrapped in a dish towel, chicken and rice, green bean, tuna noodle, each one still warm from her oven 45 minutes away. Cyrus never asked about Adeline. He never asked about Jasper. He just asked every morning when he came in, "Where do you want to start today, Miss Whitmore?" He called me Miss Whitmore for 3 weeks. And then, in mid-March, when we were finally tearing down the tarp and replacing the section of hall ceiling for real, he said, "Ren, hand me that level." That was the first time he used my first name. I cried in the kitchen later that afternoon when he was outside loading scraps into the truck, because for the first time in my life I felt seen by a man. Not the way Derek had seen us, which was not at all, but the way you were seen by somebody who decides slowly and quietly that he cares what happens to you. Silas learned more from Cyrus in 3 months than he had learned in 3 years of high school shop class. Cyrus taught him how to read a joist, how to read a load-bearing wall, how to know when a piece of old wood was still good and when it had given up. Silas took it all in. He was born for it. Meanwhile, I kept reading. Now, if you are still with me, and I hope you are, I want to ask you something. Because we are about to move into the middle part of this story. And the middle part is when it stops being a story about 2 kids in a broken house, and it starts being a story about something much bigger. I want to know if you are enjoying this, if this is the kind of story you want more of. Please subscribe to this channel. I want to keep telling you stories like this one. Stories about people the world had given up on who found each other in the last place anyone thought to look. Stories about second chances, stories about the kinds of families you don't get born into. You choose them, or sometimes they choose you. And leave me a comment. Tell me, do you believe that strangers can become family? Have you ever had someone step into your life the way Cyrus Delaney stepped into ours? Someone who owed you nothing and gave you everything just because. Your story might be the one someone else needs to hear tonight. Now come back down with me, into the studio, because we are about to find out that Jasper Whitfield was even braver than I had understood. By the spring of 1950, Adeline was seeing Jasper every week. He kept his own house in Cincinnati where he had grown up. He had his own business, running cargo flights out of a small private airstrip his father had built on family land. He kept his airplanes there most of the time, but 2 of them he kept at Adeline's little farm outside Louisville, because she wrote she liked the sound of engines overhead. because flying over her house was the same as knocking on the door. He kept his cars there too, whichever one he was driving that month. When a car broke down past saving, he would push it onto her lawn and leave it. He did not know how to throw a car away. The same way I do not know how to throw a ticket stub away. We were the same, Jasper and I. We were the same, Silas and Jasper. In 1951, Jasper bought 28 acres of farmland in a hollow 22 miles outside Louisville on a county road nobody had any reason to drive down. He hired a master mason from Bardstown. He hired a master carpenter named Callahan. And for 2 years between 1951 and 1953, he built a mansion of stone. Fieldstone he had quarried from the back of the property himself. He paid in cash, every Friday, out of an envelope he kept in his coat. He did not tell Adeline he was building it. His only rule was that the house was not to be on any map. The mailbox at the end of the drive would have no name. Nobody in town was to know who lived in it, until he said otherwise. The mansion was finished in the late spring of 1953. Jasper drove Adeline out to see it on a Saturday afternoon in June. She wrote about that day in a notebook I read by the light of the lantern at 4 a.m. It was the most private thing I had ever read in my life. He drove me down a dirt road I had never been on. He stopped at a wrought iron gate. He opened the gate. He drove up a curving drive. And at the end of the drive, there was a house I had described to him over 4 years in pieces. In sketches I had not known he was saving. In sentences I had let slip while pouring coffee. He had built the house I had told him I would build if I had ever had the money to build a house. I sat in the passenger seat for a long time. He waited beside me. He did not speak. Finally I said, "Jasper." He said, "Come and see the studio." I followed him into the house. He led me through the parlor and the dining room and the kitchen and into the east bedroom. He knelt down on the floorboards. He showed me a square seam I would not have noticed, and an iron ring set, flush. And he lifted a trapdoor. He went down first. 8 steps. The stairs were uneven. Deliberately so. I had told him once that the descent into a studio should be a deliberate act, not a thing one could do in a hurry, because the studio was a different room of the mind, and one should enter it the way one enters a chapel. I went down the 8 uneven steps. I stood on a dirt floor in a room of stone, empty, waiting. He stood beside me, and he said, "Adeline, this is yours." I closed the notebook. I sat at the kitchen table by the lantern. I looked at the trapdoor in the east bedroom, which was now technically my trapdoor, and I felt my eyes burn, because Jasper Whitfield had built that staircase 8 steps long, deliberately uneven, so that the woman he loved could enter her studio the way you enter a chapel, and then he had walked her down it, and then he had left her there to make, for the rest of her life. While he flew his airplanes over the property at low altitudes and waved from the cockpit, while he bought a Buick and a Studebaker and a Chevrolet and a delivery truck and 7 other cars and parked them on the lawn, because he could not bring himself to sell them when they broke down, because he was like me, and he was like Silas. And there are, it turns out, more of us in the world than you might think. The next big discovery came from outside. Silas found it. He had been working on cataloging the Studebaker. It had been sitting on 4 rotted tires next to a stone outbuilding for so long that it had begun to sink into the earth. Silas was crouched beside the passenger side, brushing dirt away from the running board when his hand touched metal. Not car metal, something else. He dug down maybe 6 inches into the frozen ground, and he pulled up a rust-red tin box about the size of a shoebox. It had been buried right up against the frame of the car where nobody would have looked. He brought it inside. He set it on the kitchen table. He and I looked at each other. I said together, he said together, we opened it. Inside were photographs, maybe 15 of them. Black and white, some sepia, all of them very old. And on top of the stack, one photograph larger than the others on thick paper. 2 women standing in front of the stone mansion, its steps clean, its windows unbroken, its porch newly painted. The photograph was dated in the bottom right corner in silver ink. Summer 1968. One of the women was older, maybe 55. Dark hair pulled back, a painter's smock. She was smiling. The other woman was young, very young, 20, maybe 21, blonde hair and a scarf, a summer dress, laughing at something the older woman had just said. I knew that young woman. Silas said her name at the same time I did, Grandma. We flipped the photograph over. On the back in ink that had turned the color of tea in Adeline Moretti's slanted handwriting 3 lines. For Eleanor, my youngest friend. Tell your grandchildren someday. I want you to picture two kids sitting at a kitchen table in a house they bought for $87 in the middle of nowhere in Kentucky. Silas 19 inches taller than his sister, both of them holding a photograph of a woman who had loved their grandmother when their grandmother had been young. I looked at Silas. Silas looked at me. I said, Silas. She was here. He said, Ren. She was here. I said, she wrote me that note because she knew. He said, she wrote us that note because she was trying to send us here. I want you to stop with me right here for a moment. Because if you have ever found a photograph of someone you loved, someone who is gone, standing next to a stranger in a place you never knew they had been, the exact feeling that went through my chest at that kitchen table. It is not surprise. It is recognition. The feeling that the whole shape of your life has been arranged patiently by hands you cannot see over decades. And you are only now starting to notice the pattern. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had that feeling? That your grandmother or your mother or your father arranged something for you long before you knew you would need it? I want to hear. Because those stories are the ones that keep me going. I stood up. I paced the kitchen. My heart was going 1,000 miles an hour. I said, Silas, do you understand what this means? Grandma studied with Adeline Moretti. Grandma was here in this house, in this exact house in the summer before Jasper disappeared. She was Adeline's second student. Adeline had one student, just one, Margaret Callahan, that woman on Facebook, and then, near the end, one more. Grandma. Silas said, why did Grandma never come back? I said, I don't know. Not yet. I found out 3 days later. Because on the third day after we found the photograph, I opened another one of Adeline's notebooks. Not the ones I had been reading in order, a later one, from 1968. And in September of 1968, on a page written in tight, small handwriting, pressed so hard into the page that the impression came through onto the next 4 sheets, 3 words. Jasper is gone. That was all she wrote that month. I sat in the studio with the notebook open in my lap. I looked around at the paintings. I looked at the wooden ceiling above me. I looked at the 8 steps rising up to the trapdoor. And I said out loud to nobody, he did not come back. Silas came down the steps. He said, Ren. I said he did not come back. He said, then we have to find out why. We went painting by painting. We looked behind each frame. We felt along each backing. We checked every leather scroll tube. We went through every drawer in the workbench, every envelope, and every stack. It took us 2 days. We found it on the second day. There was a painting at the back of the studio that we had walked past every day for weeks. A canvas about 4 feet wide, oil on board. The image showed 2 airplanes flying low over a property at sunset. The light golden, the field a pale green, a house in the bottom corner of the canvas with 1 warm window lit. We knew the field. We knew the house. Silas took the painting off the wall. He turned it around. And on the back of the wooden stretcher, taped flat with a strip of yellowed masking tape, was an envelope. I sat down on the dirt floor. I peeled the tape off. The adhesive had given up decades ago. The envelope opened in my hands. Inside were 6 pages of stationery folded in thirds. The handwriting at the top of the first page was not Adeline's. It was the same hand from the letters Jasper had written during construction. The same hand I had read for hours by the lantern. But it was different. Where Jasper's earlier letters had been firm, this letter was uneven. Where the letters had been crisp, these were shaky in places, as if the hand had trembled while writing. The letter was dated September 12th, 1968. The first sentence was Adeline. I am writing this with the door of the kitchen open behind me because I want to hear if you come downstairs. I read that letter aloud to Silas. He sat on the dirt floor beside me. He did not move. Jasper explained everything. He had not told her for 20 years what he had really been doing. When he came back from the war in 1945, he had not been able to go back to ordinary cargo work. He had seen too much. He had carried too much. He needed a reason to fly that was bigger than freight. In 1946, through old contacts from the war, he had been recruited into a private network. Not a government one, a privately funded one. It was called the Britannia Circle. It was Jewish, mostly. It had been founded by Holocaust survivors. Its mission was to help Jewish people who had survived the camps get out of Europe, out of the displaced persons camps where they were still being held 2 and 3 years after the war, out of Eastern European countries where the hatred that had murdered their families was still walking around in the streets. The Britannia Circle got them down to ports on the Italian and French coasts. From there, by ship onto a homeland they hoped to build. Jasper flew them, not for money. He had never taken a dollar for it. He had the family land. He did not need money. He flew them because he had seen from the cockpit of his transport plane during the war the smoke from camps he did not know the names of, and he had landed in places where the smell of those camps still hung in the trees, and he had decided that if he ever flew again, it would be to get people out. When the Britannia Circle officially ended in 1948 after Israel was founded, Jasper did not stop. He kept flying. He kept moving people through the 1950s, after the Hungarian Revolution, when refugees streamed over the Austrian border with nothing. He flew through the 1960s, when Czech intellectuals tried to get out, and Polish dissidents, and East German engineers whose names had ended up on lists they could not get off of. He flew them too, for 22 years, across 2 decades, without ever telling her. And then, in late August of 1968, after Soviet tanks rolled into Prague and Jasper spent 6 straight days flying men and women out of Vienna without sleeping, somebody talked. Jasper did not know who. He just knew that a federal agency had opened a file on him. He knew that certain investigators were looking at his name. Even in 1968, decades after the worst years of it, those investigations were still able to ruin a man. And if they came for him, and they came hard, they would find Adeline. They would find the studio. They would find the work of 17 years that she had never shown a soul. They would put her name in the newspaper. They would turn her studio into evidence. They would take the paintings, and the world she had built underground in stone and silence would be torn open by men who would not understand what they were looking at. Jasper would not allow that. So he was leaving. Not far, not forever, but for as long as it took to make the danger forget him. The car stayed, the airplane stayed, the mansion stayed, everything stayed, everything but him. The last paragraph of the letter said this: "You asked me once what flying felt like. I never gave you a good answer. I will try now. Flying felt like being in the one place where I did not have to apologize for taking up space. Flying felt like being weighed exactly the right amount. Flying felt the way coming down these 8 steps and standing in the middle of your paintings feels to me, like being where I am supposed to be. Adeline, watch the studio, watch the paintings, watch the cars. I will come back when I can. Yours always." Jasper. I sat in the studio with that letter in my lap. The light from the trap door above me had gone gold. It was late afternoon. Silas was crying. I had never seen him cry before. Not once. Not when our stepfather told him he was worthless when he was 11. Not when our mother told us to leave. Not any of the 200 nights he had held the weight of that stone mansion on his own shoulders. He cried now, silently, his hands over his face, his shoulders shaking. Jasper never came back. I knew it before I read it written down anywhere. I knew it from the airplane still on the property, from the cars rusting in the yard, from the way Mr. Ashford's hands had trembled at the gate. I read the rest of the notebooks after that. There were 3 more. From 1968 to 1970, Adeline wrote less. She painted more. She finished 31 canvases in those 2 years, more than she had finished in any 2 years of her life. She wrote in the spring of 1970. The most loyal kind of waiting is the kind that does not require the other person to come back. I have come to understand this. The studio is full. The work continues. He gave me the room. He cannot also give me his presence. One gift is enough. She died in November of 1970, of pneumonia, alone. In the upstairs bedroom of the house Jasper had built for her. She was 58 years old. Her body was found by Margaret Callahan, who had been bringing her groceries once a week ever since Jasper had stopped flying over. The house was locked up. The paintings stayed underground. The airplane stayed in the trees. The cars stayed in the yard. And nobody in town said a word about any of it for 34 years, until Silas and I bought it for $87. Now I have to stop with you again. Because if you are anything like me, you need a minute. Take a minute. Blow your nose. Wipe your eyes. Because I have not even told you the hardest part yet. And I need you steady for it. And while you are catching your breath, if this story is meaning something to you tonight, would you do me one small kindness? Just tap that subscribe button. That is how these stories get to more people. That is how a woman in Ohio or Tennessee or Kansas sitting alone with her cup of coffee gets to hear that somebody like her is not forgotten. Do it while you're thinking of it. Then come back. Because now we go to the part where they tried to take it all away from us. 3 weeks after I read Jasper's letter, I called the art history department at Bluegrass State University in Lexington. I asked if there was anyone who might be willing to come look at a collection I had found in a house I had bought. The woman on the other end of the line was patient. She got my number. She said someone would get back to me. 2 days later, a woman named Dr. Rosalind Hartwell called me. I told her what I had found, but not the names. Not yet. I just said a private collection, possibly significant in a house in the country. She came on a Tuesday morning in the second week of February. She drove a green Subaru up the dirt road I had finally cleared with a shovel Cyrus had bought me at the feed store. She got out wearing a wool coat and snow boots. She had a leather satchel in her hand. She did not introduce herself with small talk. She just said, "Show me." I led her into the house. I led her into the east bedroom. Silas knelt down and lifted the trap door. She stood looking down through it. She said 8 steps. I said yes. I went down first. She followed. When she got to the bottom and I clicked on the lantern I had by then installed properly in the center of the room, she stood in the middle of the dirt floor, and she did not say anything for 10 minutes. She walked the perimeter of the studio, slowly, stopping at every painting, bending down to look closer, standing back, standing closer, touching nothing, looking only. Silas and I stood by the staircase with our hands in our coat pockets, and we waited. When she finally spoke, her voice was different from the way it had sounded outside. It was lower, more careful, as if she were standing in a church. She said, "Do you two know what you have here?" I said, "We have an idea, but not really." She turned and faced me. She said Adeline Moretti was one of the most talented painters of her generation in this country. She trained in Florence in the late 30s under masters whose own students filled the museums of Europe. There has been speculation among art historians for 40 years about what happened to her work. She never exhibited, she never sold, she was rumored to have a private body of work, but no one knew if it had been destroyed or sold piecemeal or never existed at all. She paused. She said, "There are 134 canvases on these walls." She looked at me again. She said, "Ren, you bought this for what exactly?" I said, $87. She closed her eyes for a second. She said, "You are standing inside the largest private collection of unrecorded American art history of the 20th century, and you bought it for $87. I sat down on the dirt floor. Silas sat down beside me. She sat down across from us. None of us said anything for a long time. The light from the lantern made our shadows huge against the stone walls. 3 weeks after Dr. Hartwell's first visit, I was sweeping snow off the front porch when a black SUV with a Nashville dealer plate pulled up to my gate. I had not given anybody my address. The driver got out. He was wearing a coat that cost more than my entire wardrobe had ever cost combined. He walked up the drive in a pair of leather shoes that were going to be ruined by the slush, and he did not seem to care. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up at me with the face of a man who had been practicing being unimpressed since law school. He said, "Miss Whitmore." I said, "Yes." He said I represent the surviving descendants of Adeline Moretti. My clients are her great-grandnephew and great-grandniece Preston Crane and Vivian Crane of Nashville, Tennessee. They wish to assert their hereditary interest in the artistic estate currently in your physical possession. I stood there with the snow shovel in my hand. He took an envelope out of his coat. He held it up. He said, "We are prepared to make a generous offer for the entire collection. $200,000 for the paintings, the notebooks, the letters, everything." The wind was picking up. I felt it across the back of my neck. He smiled, the way a man smiles when he is used to people saying yes. He said, "Of course, if you would prefer not to accept our offer, we are also prepared to litigate. My clients have rights of bloodline inheritance that supersede any claim of mere physical possession. You understand that, do you not, Miss Whitmore?" I looked at the envelope. I looked at his shoes ruined in the slush. I looked past him at the 11 cars in the yard and the 2 airplanes in the trees. I looked at the house that Jasper had built for Adeline in 1953. And I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt clear. I said, "You can go now." He blinked. He said, "I am sorry." "What?" I said, "You can go now. Off my porch, off my property, through my gate." He kept smiling, but the smile had changed. He said, "Miss Whitmore, you do not have the resources to fight this. You should think carefully." I said, "Sir, I have everything I have ever owned in this house, and I am not selling any of it, especially not to people who never knew her." He looked at me for a long second, then he turned. He walked back down the drive, he got in the black SUV, he pulled away. That night, Silas and I sat by the wood stove. We did not speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "He is coming back." I said, "I know." He was right. Now, at 18 years old, would you have had the courage to say no to $200,000? Tell me honestly in the comments below, because I am not sure I would have either if it had just been about the money, but it wasn't. And you will see why in a minute. Also, do you think Ren should have taken the money and run? Or fought? Really? I want to know what you would have done, because the choice was not simple. The choice was never simple. Now let me tell you what happened next. 2 weeks later, Silas came upstairs from the studio holding a small leather notebook I had not read yet. It was the last one. The very last one Adeline had written before she died. It had been at the bottom of the stack, tucked underneath the ones I had been reading in order. I had saved it for last, the way you save the last bite of a good meal. Silas said, "Ren, sit down." He handed it to me. He said, "Read the entry from June of 1969. I opened it. I read. Adeline had written, "Margaret came out to tell me today. She was crying. It has taken her a year to find the courage. She told me that a man came to the FBI office in Louisville in the summer of 1968 and gave them a name. That name was Jasper Whitfield. The man's name was Harold Crane. He was a former cargo pilot who flew for the same charter service Jasper had used out of the Cincinnati field in the years after the war. Harold had bid for the same routes Jasper flew and had lost again and again because Jasper undercut everyone. He knew about the flights, not the full truth, but enough of it. He hated Jasper. He needed money. He sold what he knew. I have known this for 11 months. I have not written it before because to write it would be to give it a permanence I did not want it to have. But Margaret came to tell me today because it is eating her from the inside. Her cousin works at the FBI office as a secretary and she has confirmed it. Harold Crane of Nashville. That is who took him from me. Not the government, not the war, not the past. A man. A single small man who wanted my Jasper's roots and who could not have them and who found another way to hurt him. I looked up at Silas. I said, "Silas." He said, "Ren." I said, "The Cranes." He said, "Yes." I said, "Preston Crane, Vivian Crane. They are not related to Adeline at all." He said, "They are related to the man who took Jasper away." I sat down at the workbench. I put my hands flat on the wood. Silas said, "Ren, their whole claim is a lie. They are not Moretti descendants. They are Crane descendants. Descendants of a man Adeline knew by name was the reason she died alone." I said, "Do we tell our lawyer?" He said, "We tell our lawyer." Her name was Vivian Larkin. She had come to us through Dr. Hartwell. She was in her late 40s, black blazer, short gray hair, a leather portfolio. She worked pro bono with the government law clinic at the University of Kentucky. She specialized in historic preservation cases. She did not smile much at her job. She had the look of a person who wanted her job. She met us at a diner in Louisville 3 days after the SUV had come. It was a diner with the same coffee mug since 1978. She listened to the whole story, the notebooks, the letters, the photograph of Grandma, Jasper's last letter, the Britannia Circle, Preston, Vivian, Howard Ashby. She drank her coffee. She took notes in a small black notebook with a fountain pen. When we were done, she set the pen down. She said, "Ren, Silas, Adeline Moretti documented everything. Every painting has a date, a technique notation, a reference. The notebooks are a complete archive of her production. This is not just art. This is documented cultural heritage. And documented cultural heritage has legal protection that distant blood claimants cannot easily contest." She closed her notebook. She said, "And now that you have found the June 1969 entry well, their entire claim rests on being descendants of Adeline. If they are not Adeline's descendants at all, if they are in fact descendants of the man who informed on her partner." She looked at me over the top of her glasses. She said, "Ren, they just handed us their own defeat. If we can prove it, we spent the next 4 months proving it." Cyrus drove me to the county courthouse in Louisville twice a week. I pulled deeds. I pulled property records. I pulled everything on Harold Crane going back to 1948. I found his name on the roster of a small cargo company that had flown out of the same airfield as Jasper's. I found lawsuits he had filed and lost. I found a bank record showing a payment to him in 1968 from an account that traced 6 steps removed to a discretionary fund that had once been used by federal informants. Silas did his own work. He photographed every airplane, every serial number, every plaque. He worked with an aviation historian Dr. Hartwell put us in touch with. Together, they built a documented flight history of Jasper Whitfield from 1946 to 1968 that any court would accept. Meanwhile, Vivian filed papers. She nominated the entire Property House studio cars, airplanes, land for the National Register of Historic Places. She filed the same nomination with the Kentucky State Historic Preservation Office. Every layer of protection she could put between us and the cranes she put there. While we worked, the winter dug back at us. The worst storm of that whole winter hit in mid-February. 2 feet of snow in 18 hours, 60-mile-an-hour winds. A piece of the roof over the upstairs hallway collapsed, and Silas had to climb up there in the dark with a flashlight in his mouth and a tarp under his arm and nail the tarp down himself by lantern light. Because Cyrus was on the other side of the county helping his daughter shovel out her driveway. He sliced his hand on the edge of the tarp. He bled through his glove. He came back inside his coat caked in ice. He sat down on the kitchen floor next to the wood stove, and he held his bleeding hand against his chest, and he laughed out loud. He laughed for a long time. He had not laughed like that in years. I sat down beside him. I bandaged his hand with kitchen towel and electrical tape, and I laughed with him, because we were 2 kids in a house we had bought for $87, and we were alive, and there was a wood stove, and the studio was still down there waiting. The next morning, Silas and I did something I want to tell you about. I had unpacked my suitcases for the first time. 4 months I had been in that house, and I had not unpacked my suitcases. I sat down on the parlor floor with all 4 of them open, and I dumped them out into one enormous pile. Every receipt I had ever kept, every ticket stub, every leaf, the dried out brown leaf from the first day of high school, pieces of plastic from broken toys I had loved when I was 6, Buster's collar tag, my grandmother's tin. Cyrus came in to drop off a roll of insulation. He saw me sitting in the middle of the pile. He did not ask what I was doing. He sat down on the parlor floor across from me. He picked up a movie ticket. He looked at it. He said, Ocean's 11, 2010. Were you alone or with someone? I said I went with my mother. He nodded. He put the ticket back in the pile. He picked up the dog collar tag. He said, "Whose dog?" I said, "Buster. He died 4 years ago in the back of a station wagon on the way to the vet." He nodded again. He picked up a long, faded piece of pale ribbon. He held it up. He said, "And this?" I said, "It was on a flower arrangement at my grandmother's funeral. I was 10. He nodded one more time. Then he set the ribbon down, very carefully, on the pile. He said, "Young lady, there is a difference between keeping things and being kept by them." I felt my eyes burn. He said, "You are not the things in this pile. You are the girl who lived everything that is on the other end of them. Those are 2 different things." He looked at me for a long second. He said very gently, "What you are afraid of is not the throwing away. What you are afraid of is that if you let go of any of it, then nobody on this earth ever loved you, because all you have is the proof that they did." I started crying. He let me cry. He did not move. He did not touch me. He just sat across the pile from me on the cold floor of a stone house and waited. When I was done, he said, "Pick out 3 things." I said 3. He said 3. Just for today. 3 things you cannot bear to set down. Set them aside. The rest we will sort through together, one at a time, and if anything else is too much to let go, we will keep it. But 3 first. Tell yourself you can do 3. I picked up 3 things. My grandmother's note that said the world was bigger than this kitchen. A photograph of me on a Ferris wheel at the Kentucky State Fair when I was 8, my mother and I both laughing at the camera. And Buster's dog collar tag. 3 things. We spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through the pile. 1 piece at a time, Cyrus would pick something up. He would hand it to me. He would say nothing. I would look at it. I would decide. Some things I kept. Most things I let go. Each time I let go of something, I did not feel I was losing it. I felt I was finally telling it, "Thank you. You did your job. You held the memory until I could carry the memory by myself." Silas came in that afternoon. He watched us for a while from the doorway. Then he came and sat down next to me, and he did not say a word. He just began sorting his own small box, the small box of things he had brought with him, which was not many. A picture of our grandmother, a pocket knife of our grandfather's, A ticket stub from a Cincinnati Reds game he had gone to with a friend when he was 13. Silas kept them all, because Silas had never kept them out of fear. Silas had kept them out of love. And Love Cyrus said when he saw what Silas had chosen, "Love you get to keep." By sunset, there was a small box of things I had kept, and a much bigger pile of things to be burned in the wood stove. Cyrus stayed for dinner. We made grilled cheese sandwiches on the wood stove. He told us about Ruthie, about their daughter, about their 3 grandchildren and his one good knee. He drove home around 9, and after he was gone, I sat by the wood stove and I burned the pile one handful at a time. The fire that night was the warmest fire I have ever had in my life. The next morning was cold and sharp. I walked out across the yard, past the 11 cars, past the snow that had drifted up against their bumpers and their bent hoods. I walked all the way to the back of the property past the pines, and I stood in front of the 2 airplanes. I had not done this since we arrived. I had walked past them, I had glanced at them, but I had never stood in front of them, just stood. The way you stand in front of a grave. Silas came out with me. He stood beside me. The transport plane was the bigger one, the C-47 he had identified. Its faded white star, its bent propellers, its landing gear sunk deep into the earth. The other was the Beechcraft, a civilian bird, somebody's private pilot plane. Silas said Wren. I said yes. He said, I know we do not have the money to fly them again, and maybe we never will. But someday, when we do have money, I do not want to fly them. I said no. He said, I just want to fix them enough that they can stand another 100 years, right here, where he parked them. I said yes. We stood there in the cold, our breath coming out in white clouds. I said out loud to the airplanes and to the man who had parked them there, Jasper, I am not going to move you. I am not going to sell you. I am not going to scrap you. You are going to stay exactly where you parked yourself for as long as we are here. And after we are here, we will leave instructions, so that the next person knows you are staying. You did your job, you are home, we went back inside. I called Vivian. I told her I wanted the airplanes and the cars listed on the National Register nomination as part of the historic property, not as removable assets, as permanent fixtures of the site. She said Wren. That is unusual. I said Vivian. So is everything else about this place. She added it to the nomination. The surrogate's court hearing was set for the 28th of April. I want you to picture the courtroom. A long, narrow room on the second floor of the Louisville courthouse. High windows, a long bench, an American flag on a pole in the corner, and a Kentucky state flag beside it. A wooden gallery for the public with maybe 40 seats. I sat on one side with Vivian Larkin. Silas beside me. He had bought a shirt with a collar from the thrift store on 2nd Street. He looked like a young man. He looked like Jasper Whitfield in one of the Army Air Corps photos from 1944. On the other side sat Howard Ashby, with Preston and Vivian Crane behind him. They were in their 40s, both well-dressed. Preston had the haircut that cost $90 in Nashville. Vivian was wearing a coat that probably cost what I would make at the Piggly Wiggly in 2 months. They had not looked at us once. The judge was a woman named Patricia Holloway, 60-something, gray hair cut short. A judge who had been doing this job long enough to know exactly what was in front of her and exactly what was not. She gavelled the room to order at 10. Howard Ashby went first. He stood up, he buttoned his jacket, he spoke for 40 minutes about hereditary right, about bloodline, about the unbroken line of descent from Adeline Moretti through her younger sister to her sister's grandchildren. He said the word bloodline 11 times. I counted. He sat down. He did not look at me. Then Vivian stood up. She did not button her jacket. She did not raise her voice. She walked to the front of the room. She said, Your Honor, I would like to call 3 witnesses before I present argument. Judge Holloway said, Proceed. Vivian's first witness was Dr. Rosalind Hartwell. She testified about the collection, about Adeline's training in Florence, about the documentation in the notebooks. She testified that the National Register nomination had been formally accepted for review 3 days earlier. She testified that the Kentucky State Historic Preservation Office had already issued a preliminary determination of eligibility. Howard Ashby tried to challenge her. She pulled the determination letter out of her bag. The judge read it. Vivian's second witness was Wendy Bennett. Wendell had driven down from Millbrook Springs in a borrowed truck. She was wearing the only blazer she owned. She looked nervous. Vivian asked her 3 questions. First, did Wren and Silas Whitmore spend 3 nights on your floor in early December? Wendell said, yes. Second, why? Wendell said because their mother had thrown them out. Third, when Wren found the property in the classifieds the following week, did she tell you about it? Wendell said she did. Vivian said, "Thank you." She turned to Howard Ashby. Your witness. Howard Ashby did not cross-examine. Vivian's third witness was Margaret Callahan. She was 86 years old. She walked up to the witness stand with a cane and Cyrus Delaney's arm under her elbow. He had driven her in his truck. She sat down. She set a small canvas wrapped in brown paper on the witness stand in front of her. She unwrapped it. It was a painting about 2 feet wide, a still life, 3 peaches in a wooden bowl, a blue ceramic pitcher, a folded linen napkin. The brushwork was unmistakable. Margaret held the painting up so the judge could see it. She said, "Your Honor, Adeline Moretti was my teacher from 1965 to 1967. I was 27 years old when I started walking out to her house every Saturday. I had been a widow for a year. She did not charge me. She did not charge anyone. She gave me this painting on the day she ended our lessons. She said, 'Keep it, so you will remember that you can make something beautiful, even when no one is watching.'" Margaret set the painting down. She looked at Preston and Vivian Crane. She said, "I have kept this painting for 58 years on a wall above my piano. I have never once thought of it as worth money. I have thought of it only as a gift from a woman who loved nobody in this courtroom, except perhaps the 2 young people sitting beside Mrs. Larkin." She paused. She said, "Preston, Vivian, your great-aunt's house had a kitchen. She kept butter cookies in a blue tin on the second shelf of the pantry. She made tea with loose leaves in a chipped enamel teapot. When she was at the workbench in her studio, the smell of linseed oil filled the whole downstairs. I am telling you these things because they are details, and the people who actually loved her would know them, and the people who only wanted her money would not." You could hear the radiator clicking in the courtroom. Margaret took a breath. She said, "Your Honor, I would like to give this painting back, so that they can be together the way Adeline made them." Howard Ashby did not cross-examine. Vivian Larkin stood up. She said, "Your Honor, I would now like to present argument." But before she could begin, the courtroom door opened at the back. Everybody in the gallery turned. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall, stooped, maybe 76 years old, white hair, a coat I had seen once before, 4 months earlier, at a gate, in falling snow. It was Mr. Ashford. He walked down the center aisle slowly. He held a leather folio under his arm. He stopped at the gate of the bar. He said, "Your Honor, my name is Ellsworth Ashford. I sold the property in question to Miss Whitmore and her brother in December of last year. I would like to be heard on this matter, if the court permits." Judge Holloway looked at Howard Ashby. Howard Ashby looked at Preston Crane. Preston Crane looked for the first time since the hearing began at me. The judge said, "Mr. Ashford, please come forward and be sworn in." Mr. Ashford walked to the witness stand. He sat down. He raised his right hand. He swore. He set the leather folio on the witness rail in front of him. He looked across the room at me. I want you to understand the look he gave me. It was the same look he had given me the day I bought the house, that look of relief, of a weight finally being set down. Only now it was bigger. Now it had eyes that were wet. He cleared his throat. He said, "My full name is Ellsworth Ashford. I am 76 years old. I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. My mother's maiden name was Elena Whitfield." He paused. He said Jasper Whitfield was my uncle. The courtroom was completely silent. Mr. Ashford continued. "Jasper never had children. He never married. My mother was his only sibling. When my mother died in 1980, I inherited her interest in any of his property. Jasper Whitfield. My uncle, the man who built that house, left the property in 1968 under circumstances I will not describe in detail here. Suffice it to say, he had reasons. He never came back. He lived the rest of his life in California under the name he used for his business dealings out there. He died in October of 1989. I was at his bedside." He looked at Preston Crane and then at Vivian Crane. He said, "Before he died, my uncle gave me 3 things. He gave me a set of keys. He gave me the deeds to 28 acres of land in Kentucky, and he gave me one instruction." He opened the leather folio. He took out a single page, aged, folded twice, a man's handwriting on it. He said, "He told me if anyone ever came along who was willing to take care of that house and what was in it, who did not know me, who was not after the paintings, who needed a place, I was to give it to them for whatever they could afford." He paused. He said, He told me if no one ever came, I was to keep paying the taxes and let the property go on standing until I died, and then I was to write that same instruction into my own will, and the property would wait as long as it had to. He looked at the judge. He said, "Your Honor, this is the original instruction signed by Jasper Whitfield, dated August 14th, 1985, witnessed by 2 attorneys in San Diego, California." He handed the page up to the judge. Judge Holloway read it. She read it twice. She passed it across to Howard Ashby. Howard Ashby read it. His expression did not change, but his shoulders did. Then Mr. Ashford reached inside the folio one more time. He took out a second envelope. He said, "Your Honor, there is one more thing." He said my uncle also left in that same drawer a personal letter, sealed. He instructed me to open it only if 2 specific people arrived at that property. He gave me their names. He looked at me. He said Wren Whitmore, Silas Whitmore. Silas's hand found mine under the table. Mr. Ashford opened the envelope. He removed a single folded page. He read from it. To the grandchildren of Eleanor Peterson. If you are hearing this letter read, then you have found the house. That means one of 2 things. Either fate has been kinder than I dared hope for, or a woman whose name was Adeline Moretti kept a promise across 60 years one summer at a time. Your grandmother Eleanor came to me and to Adeline in the summer of 1968. She was 20 years old. She was Margaret Callahan's cousin. Margaret brought her out to the house one Saturday because Adeline had said she wanted a second student before the light went out of her hands. Eleanor stayed for 6 weeks. She did not know how to paint yet. She was learning. She was young. She was, I remember this well, the most beautiful laugher I had ever heard in my life. She left in September because I had to leave. And when I left, I locked the house. And I asked Margaret to tell Eleanor that Adeline could not teach anymore, because I did not want Eleanor connected to me. I did not want the men who were looking for me to find her too. Eleanor never came back, but she wrote to Adeline for 2 years. Adeline kept every letter. They are in the studio in a packet under the workbench. Eleanor lived, she married, she had a daughter, she had grandchildren. I do not know your names. I have never seen your faces. But if you have found this letter, then somewhere deep inside, you is the blood of a young woman who once stood in a Kentucky studio with dust in a shaft of light and looked at Adeline and me and said the words, "I have never been anywhere I felt so at home." The house is yours. It has been yours since 1968. It just took 34 years to reach you. Watch over what we made. Yours, Jasper Whitfield. Mr. Ashford folded the letter. He set it on the witness rail. He looked at me. I could not see him clearly. There was too much water in my eyes. Silas's shoulders were shaking, silently, beside me. The judge waited. Then she said, "Mrs. Larkin, do you wish to incorporate this testimony into your argument?" Vivian said, "Your Honor, I do not believe further argument is necessary." The judge looked at Howard Ashby. He stood up. He said, "Your Honor, we request a recess." The judge said, "Denied. I have heard enough." She set the pages Mr. Ashford had given her down on her desk. She said, "The court finds the following. The decedent Adeline Moretti died intestate in 1970. However, the artistic estate in question was not held in her name. It was held on real property owned by Jasper Whitfield. Jasper Whitfield left a binding directive in 1985 specifying that the property and its contents be transferred for nominal consideration to a purchaser meeting certain criteria with the express purpose of preservation. He also left personal instructions identifying by lineage the specific persons he intended to receive that property." She paused. She said, "Those persons are Wren Whitmore and Silas Whitmore." She looked at Preston and Vivian Crane. She said, "I would add for the record that this court has now been made aware through documented archival testimony that the petitioner's great-grandfather, Harold Crane, is the individual who provided the information to federal investigators in 1968, which caused Colonel Jasper Whitfield to abandon his home. I will not consider this in my ruling as it is not legally material, but I will state for the sake of the record that I have noted it." She brought the gavel down. She said, "The petition of Preston Crane and Vivian Crane is denied. Title is quieted. This court will not entertain further challenges on this matter. Adjourned." I did not jump up. I did not cry out. I did not run to Vivian. I sat there, in the wooden chair at the petitioner's table, with my hands flat on the table in front of me, and Silas's hand still holding mine. And I looked at the wall across the courtroom, and in my head, very quietly, I said, "Adeline, Jasper, Grandma. We did it. Mr. Ashford came across the bar. He stood beside me. He said, "Miss Whitmore." I said, "Mr. Ashford." He reached into his coat. He took out a photograph. He set it on the table in front of me. It was black and white. A man in his early 70s sitting on the steps of a small bungalow somewhere in California. Bougainvillea behind him. A wedding ring on a leather cord around his neck. A book in his lap. Half glasses on his nose. The same slight tilt to the way he held himself that I had seen in the Army Air Corps photograph from 1944. He was smiling. The smile of a man who had been alone for a long time and had made his peace with it. On the back of the photograph in pencil, 2 lines, for whoever finds her work. Tell her I lived well. I want to tell you what came after. Because what came after is the part I want you to remember. The restoration of the mansion took almost a year. Cyrus led the crew. He brought his nephew. He brought 2 younger carpenters. We kept the fieldstone facade. We kept every floorboard that was still sound. Cyrus forged a new iron handrail for the 8 uneven steps to the studio, because he said he was not going to put aluminum on a staircase that old. The studio itself was restored under the supervision of a conservator Dr. Hartwell brought up. She wore white cotton gloves. She knew the name of every brand of paint Adeline had used. When she was done, the studio looked exactly the same, only clean. When it was finished in October, I went down the 8 steps for the first time after the restoration. Silas went with me. We stood in the middle of the room, and Silas said out loud to nobody, Adeline, "Jasper, it's still yours. We just live here now." There was one more thing. Under the workbench, exactly where Jasper's letter had said they would be, we found the packet, 27 letters, from a young woman named Eleanor Peterson to her teacher, from 1968, from 1969, from 1970, right up until the month Adeline died. Adeline had kept everyone. I sat down on the studio floor with Silas beside me, and we read the letters our grandmother had written when she was our age. She wrote about a summer she wished she could relive. She wrote about a stone house at the end of a dirt road. She wrote about a woman who had told her that art was the only way a lonely person could speak to the future. In her last letter, dated October 1970, she wrote Adeline, "I have a little daughter now. I named her Marlene. When she is old enough, I will bring her to you. I promise. E." Adeline died a month later. Grandma never brought my mother. But eventually, without meaning to, without knowing it, Grandma brought us. There was a small outbuilding on the property, 20 feet by 30. Originally a tack room for the horse Jasper had kept in the 50s. We turned it into a Saturday workshop. Every Saturday morning from 9 to noon from the first week of October through the end of May, the workshop opens its doors, free of charge, to any child from Millbrook Springs between the ages of 8 and 15 who wants to come. Dr. Hartwell sends one of her graduate students up from Lexington every week to teach. Margaret Callahan comes every Saturday she is able. She is 86 now. She does not do much. She sits in a rocking chair in the corner of the workshop with a hot cup of tea and watches the children draw. Sometimes she goes over to a child who is stuck. She looks at what they are making. She says very gently, "What if you put a window there?" And the child puts a window there, and the drawing becomes something the child did not know they could make. Cyrus comes sometimes. He sits on the porch with his coffee. He watches the kids run between the workshop and the main house. Wendell brings her 2 little girls now. Silas teaches the older kids how to take apart small engines. In the barn where the Studebaker still sits, rusted, beautiful, right where Jasper left it. There is a boy who comes every Saturday. His name is Isaac. He is 9 years old. His father works 2 jobs. His mother is not around. He walks 1.5 miles from the county road to get to us. He does not talk very much. He always brings his own pencil sharpened down almost to the wood in a mason jar with a rubber band around it. The second Saturday he came, Silas taught him how to open the hood of the old Studebaker. Isaac stood on an overturned milk crate to reach. I watched them from the porch. Silas showed Isaac the carburetor. He put a wrench in Isaac's hand. He said, "You want to try?" Isaac looked up at my brother the way Silas used to look up at Cyrus Delaney. And I thought, so this is how it works. This is how it moves. From Adeline to Grandma. From Jasper to Ellsworth. From Cyrus to Silas. From Silas to Isaac. Somebody sees you, and then someday you see somebody else. And the thing gets carried a little further. Above the door of the workshop, Cyrus carved a wooden sign from a piece of black walnut. The sign reads, "The most abandoned place in the world can become the most alive. All it takes is for someone to decide to stay." I took the line from one of Adeline's last notebook entries. The 11 cars are still on the property. We have not moved them. The 2 airplanes are still on the property. We have not moved them. A vintage automobile collector drove out from Lexington the summer after the trial. He told me 3 of the cars could be restored. I thanked him. I said no, all 11 stay. An aviation enthusiast came out a few months later. He told me the C-47 could be flown again. I told him no too. The airplanes stay where Jasper Whitfield parked them. Not because they are not beautiful enough to be saved, but because they are beautiful enough exactly as they are. There is one more thing I want to tell you. The article came out in October of last year in the Lexington Herald Leader. A woman named Jessica Ford wrote it. It was picked up by the wire services. The story got out. Adeline Moretti got written up in the New York Times. Dr. Hartwell put together an exhibition at the Speed Art Museum in Louisville. 14,000 people came to see it in the first month. And one afternoon in October, I was working on a windowsill in the front parlor when I heard a car come up the drive. A blue sedan I did not recognize. The driver's door opened, a woman got out. She was in her early 50s, hair more gray than blonde. A coat I knew very well. It was my mother. She stood at the foot of the porch. I stood at the top. We did not move toward each other. She said, "Ren." I said, "Hello, Mom." She said, "I drove out. I wanted to see for myself that you were both okay." Silas came out onto the porch behind me. He said nothing. He just stood beside me. I looked at her. I looked at her for a long time. I thought about the night in early December when I had stood at the door of her house waiting for her to say my name. I thought about the woman on the other side of the wall who had not come out. I came down the porch steps. Silas came with me. We stopped in front of her. I did not hug her. She did not try to hug me. I reached into my coat pocket. I took out a folded piece of yellow stationery. I handed it to her. She unfolded it. She read it. It was a copy I had made. The original was in the studio. It was her mother's note, my grandmother Eleanor's note. There are houses in this world that are waiting for children who don't have any. My mother held the piece of paper. She read it twice. Her eyes filled with water. She tried to swallow it. She couldn't. She said, "I didn't know she wrote you that." I said, "She did. She was right. Keep the note. I want you to read it sometimes, and I want you to drive safely going home." I did not say it cruelly. I did not say it to hurt her. I said it because it was true. She folded the note. She held it against her coat over her heart. She said, "All right." She got in her car. She drove down our dirt road, through our gate. I closed the gate after her. That was the last time I saw her. There is one more thing. A week after our mother came, I drove into town. I had not been back to Mr. Petrov's newsstand since the day I copied the phone number onto the back of my hand. I brought with me a photograph, a copy of the one Mr. Ashford had given me, Jasper Whitfield, on the steps of his California bungalow, smiling. I walked into the newsstand. Mr. Petrov looked up over the top of his glasses. He said, "Miss Whitmore." I said, "Yes, sir." I set the photograph on the counter in front of him. He looked at it. He did not move for a long time. Then his hands began to shake. He said something in Ukrainian I did not understand. Then he said in English in a voice that was not his voice, "This man, this man, this man brought me to America when I was 3 years old, on a plane. I have wondered my whole life what his name was, who he was." I said his name was Jasper Whitfield. Mr. Petrov looked up at me. He was crying. An 81-year-old man behind a newsstand counter in Kentucky. He was crying like a small child. He said, "I have waited my whole life to say thank you." I came around the counter, and I hugged him. I hugged him for a long time in front of the Reader's Digest condensed books and the Trident gum. And I said the words that Jasper had asked me to say. On behalf of a man who had died in a small bungalow in San Diego 36 years ago, I said, "He heard you. He knows." I am 20 years old now. I am in my second year at Bluegrass State University. Dr. Hartwell is one of my mentors. She tells me I should go to graduate school. She tells me she can help me apply. I have not decided yet. Silas is 18. He is finishing his final year of high school on a homeschool arrangement Cyrus's daughter set up for us. Silas has decided he wants to be a mechanical engineer, but a special kind, the kind that restores old machines. He has already been offered a summer apprenticeship at an aviation museum outside Cincinnati. The mansion is on the National Register of Historic Places. It is open to the public by appointment 1 day a week. Dr. Hartwell moderates the visitor list. The 11 cars are still on the property, the 2 airplanes are still on the property, the trap door in the east bedroom is original, the 8 uneven steps are original, the workbench is original, the cast iron pot is still on the kitchen stove. We have not moved a thing that did not need to be moved. Sometimes in the afternoons when the light comes through the parlor windows and long gold bars, I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and I watch the snow fall, or the leaves fall, or the rain fall. And I think about what I learned in this house. I learned that there is a difference between keeping things and being kept by them. I learned that you can be abandoned and still build something that lasts. I learned that the most loyal kind of waiting is the kind that does not require the other person to come back. I learned that some places in this world are waiting for the people the world has decided not to want. And if you are one of those people, if you are watching this on your couch in Ohio, or your kitchen table in Tennessee, or your screen porch in Michigan, if you have ever stood at a door waiting for someone to come out of a kitchen and say your name and they did not come, I want you to know, there is a house out there for you too. It may not have 11 cars and 2 airplanes in the yard. It may not have 134 hidden paintings under the floor. It may not have a stranger named Ellsworth Ashford waiting at the gate with a key on a leather strap. But it has 4 walls and a roof. And somewhere in it, something waiting to be found. All it takes is for you to decide to stay. And when you finally decide, the whole world will move around you to make room. That is what Grandma Eleanor was trying to tell me in a note folded twice in the bottom of a tin, waiting 8 years for me to be brave enough to open it. That is what Adeline Moretti was trying to tell me in 134 canvases painted in a dark room by a woman nobody was watching. That is what Jasper Whitfield was trying to tell me in a letter left inside an envelope taped to the back of a painting, waiting 34 years for 2 frozen kids from Kentucky to come find it. The world was bigger than my mother's kitchen. The world was bigger than the bench at the bus stop. The world was bigger than $87 and a green suitcase with 1 wheel missing and a stone house at the end of a dirt road that nobody in 3 counties would touch. The world was bigger, and it was waiting for me, and it is waiting for you too. Thank you for spending this evening with me. Before you go, would you do me one last thing? If any part of this story touched your heart tonight, please subscribe to this channel. That is how we get to keep telling stories like this one. Stories about second chances and the families we find and the way love reaches across time when we least expect it. And leave a comment. Just 1 line. Tell me what part of this story stayed with you the most. Was it Grandma's note in the tin? Was it Cyrus sitting across the pile from Wren? Was it Mr. Petrov behind the counter? Was it a 9-year-old boy named Isaac standing on a milk crate to reach the hood of a rusted Studebaker? I read them. All of them. And when you leave one, you leave a light on for the next person who finds this story in the middle of a long night. This story is a work of fiction, but the feelings in it are real, and so are you. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other, and keep your eyes open. Because the world is bigger than the kitchen you're sitting in, I promise.